So you see in these countries, they try to go negative, but what they saw is that people are piling into cash and hoarding cash outside of the banking system, who want to have their money at risk. Because when you put your money in the bank, it's not yours, it's the bank's money that you lend to them. And you actually are giving that away, and you're paying money for them to actually use that money and then go and speculate in the stock market or wherever else derivatives they would create and so on. It doesn't make sense whatsoever. And so we got to a point of monetary insanity with these Keynesians trying desperately to, prop the system up. And I don't know where this is going to go.
SDBullion.com is a high-volume physical gold, silver, and precious metal dealer. We are committed to being your trusted source for low-cost, highest quality investment-grade bullion products. Visit SDBullion.com for more information.
Welcome to Silver Doctors. Today I'm excited to have first-time guest, Mr. John Sneisen. He's an economist as well as best-selling author. Today he's joining us to share his thoughts on the global economy as well as the financial markets. So John, welcome to Silver Doctors.
Thank you for having me on, Mike.
Well, I appreciate you taking time to sit down with us. Definitely looking forward to getting your take on the markets and a variety of subject matter. And you're currently located up in Canada, so definitely want to find out how things are up in your home country as well. So before we dive any further, for those that may not know who John Sneisen is, can you give us a little bit of your background and how you've arrived at this current point in your career?
Sure. Well, it started 2008, actually. That's when my economic career started. I have a different background of telecom communications that I used to work with. But in 2008, I went to a conference and I saw Robert Kiyosaki speak. And he forced me down a rabbit hole because I was shocked of the information that he showed me back in 2008. And so I read his book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And then after, I think it was a year after that, I read another book of one of his advisors, which was Mike Maloney, which was called The Investing in Gold and Silver. And that's how I, started to really dive down the rabbit hole. And I believe it was 2008. So by 2013, I kind of decided that I actually know enough now. I'd been reading, being like kind of a keyboard warrior. Maybe it's time to actually do something myself. So I started, on a big search, and I found something called Freedom Force International, which G. Edward Griffin, the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island. And so I went to actually the first Congress that is set up for this organization. And I ended up being very blessed, being elected as a leadership council member and worked directly with Ed Griffin now for 5 years. But after that day, I remember I need to take some serious action, I said to myself. And what I did was I was trying to search out somebody here locally in Winnipeg, Canada, that was doing similar kind of works of what I did. And then I bumped into a guy that had something called Winnipeg Alternative Media. And suddenly after that, I think it was a half a year, and we decided to partner up, and we created the World Alternative Media together in December of 2014. And now it's been 4 years of going deep down into economics and money and trying to educate people on a worldwide scale. And of course, in 2014 and 15, I've written 2 books. One is called The End of Freedom: How Our Monetary System Enslaves Us, and the other one is actually a Canadian book, which is called Canada, the Greatest Economy in the World? And it was based upon an article that was written in a Canadian magazine boasting how wonderful the Canadian economy was and that it was a bright future and so on. So that's kind of my background. And then, of course, I do tons of economic analysis now. I try to educate the population by easily put out information that is understandable in a way that the layman can understand it. Because if you start to go into all this economic jargon, it's going to be very, very hard for people. So I kind of used that Robert Kiyosaki approach of the first book that I read, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, trying to create it as easy as possible for people to understand money, economics, and how the world, turns around.
Understandable. So thank you for giving us an explanation there. And so let's dive into some meat and potatoes of this whole discussion. And I'm curious to find out, we're beyond halfway through the year 2019. We've had a Fed cut. We've had a variety of currency situations out here. So you cover these things extensively. What are some things right now that really concern you, or what are some things that you're trying to, inform your viewers and your readers on most nowadays?
Well, what's going on recently? I don't know if people have paid some interest to what's happening in the markets right now. The volatility is back again, and of course, gold and silver has been moving up substantially of what they usually have been. They usually have had a ceiling of 1350 gold in US dollars, but then suddenly it's poked through that and actually gotten some momentum just over the last couple of days as we speak. So things have happened there. People might ask themselves, like, why is this happening with the economy? Like, why is gold on the move? Is it because of the trade tensions? That's what at least the mainstream news media is trying to portray it as. It's all this trade tension between U.S. and China. But I think there's a huge, bigger underlying problem, and it's the $55+ trillion of global debt that's out there that is the actual problem. That is a substantial problem that we are going to deal with very soon. And I think what we've seen so far and over the last just year, how substantial the volatility comes and goes, and people just think that it's going to go away. But I remember me and Josh on our channel, World Alternative Media, we were discussing way back, this is probably almost 4 years ago, when we were discussing that the Fed will try to raise interest rates up, and then we predicted that they wouldn't get too far up. They would have to start cutting because they would be in trouble with the actual real economy. And what they were seeing is, of course, the debt problems here that the United States. It's not just the United States. Everywhere we have massive debt problems. Here in Canada, we're in a substantial debt bubble, both on household credit. And also our housing markets, not so much in Winnipeg, but in Toronto and Vancouver, it's substantial, overly valued real estate right now. And I believe Canada is number 2 real estate bubble in the world after New Zealand right now. So Canada's economy is, really struggling as well, but it's all this underlying debt problem that nobody's really talking about in the mainstream. Of course, there's a ton of us in the alternative media world of finance that actually are, really been seeing this for the last, some of them, 20 years, the guys that have been the longest at this. And people are kind of waking up to and seeing that they're not being able to afford all the things that they could anymore. And of course, what I found is the connection between when you pay too much taxes as well, like the highest tax countries are the most indebted countries as well. So what you're seeing is because people are, paying more and more taxes, well, they have to substantiate the money that they actually are making that is less now because there's more money taken out in taxes. Well, now you actually have to they go out and borrow money to have the same living standards.
Yeah.
So you're seeing that in Norway, Canada, to a point in the United States, a bunch of places as well. But it's mostly like Australia, the Scandinavian countries, and Canada and New Zealand that have really been on a rip of a massive bubble. But then again, you're seeing currently saw just the anticipation of the Federal Reserve rate cut was actually the I believe it was South Korea, Russia, I forgot. I think it was 1 or 2 more central banks that actually cut the interest rates in the anticipation of that rate cut. But what we got to understand is that, when the Federal Reserve starts to cut rates after having it stable for a time or having it going up, it's not going to go up again. It's going to go substantially down here. That's what I think, at least. If you look at the chart of, I have a chart of the since 1955 that I'm looking at that shows how much they dropped the interest rates in a crisis. And it was in 2000 they dropped it 7.5%. In 2008 they dropped 5.2% in order to try to stimulate the economy. So where are we going to go from? In the United States it was 2.5. Well, if you're going to drop it 5%, let's say 5%, well, now you're negative 2.5%. How are they going to go into negative interest rates, you might ask, because you had countries like Switzerland, Japan, You have a lot of parts of Europe now are negative interest rates, like Sweden, Denmark, and Switzerland. So you're seeing these countries, they try to go negative, but what they saw is that people are piling into cash and hoarding cash outside of the banking system. And it's because it's negative interest rate. Who want to have their money at risk? Because when you put your money in the bank, it's not yours, it's the bank's money that you lend to them. And you actually are giving that away, and you're paying money for them to actually use that money and then go and speculate in the stock market or wherever else derivatives they would create and so on. It doesn't make sense whatsoever. And so we got to a point of monetary insanity with these Keynesians trying desperately to, prop the system up. And I don't know where this is going to go.
Now, one of the things you start off with was the whole idea of debt. And so we've kind of reached a point where debt is becoming the problem, and there's no way of hiding or running from it. And, not long ago in the U.S., the debt ceiling, or that illusion of them trying to put a cap on how much they can borrow per fiscal year is removed for 2 years. So what do you anticipate? Because someone mentioned it's basically a free printing pass or free pass to print money that will be given to our government as well as President Trump. What do you see? What type of numbers do you think they're going to be running in deficits as the economy slows down?
I think the deficits is going to be quite substantial. And what we're going to see, because we have so much in the United States, there's so much unfunded liabilities. That's a huge problem for the United States. And I want you guys to look up US debt clock and take a look at the actual current debt that the United States has. And when you look at the current deficit, the real actual deficit, it's $1.16 trillion right now. And that is very substantial. And of course, if you look at the debt to GDP ratio is now about 106%. So what you're seeing there is usually over time, and I read Rob Dalio's book, just recent book that he came out with, The Big Debt Crises. It was called, where he goes through a whole bunch of different countries and their debt collapses throughout history. Just recent history. And he was saying, when it passes past 100% debt to GDP, usually there's no point of return. A nation is then set to default on their debt. And it doesn't look very well for the United States when it comes to that debt. And not just the United States, you're looking at, Canada, we just passed $1 trillion in debt. Like, it might not seem a lot for Canada, but if you look at $1 trillion versus, the U.S. economy, it's actually quite substantial because we're 10 times smaller of an economy. So we're seeing kind of this peak debt on a worldwide scale here. And I think you're going to see, because of the money that's on Medicare, Medicaid, all these unfunded liabilities, which means that they've been promised, but they don't have funding for them through tax payments and tax revenue. So what's going to happen is they're probably going to have to go to $3, $4, $5, $6 trillion deficits in order to cover this. And you can quite easily see over the next just 5 years how that becomes extremely unsustainable. Now, of course, they're going to try to, push down the interest rates probably here and down to zero and maybe into negative. But it's crazy in Europe, for example. Let's just look at where we're going to head here. Because in Europe, pension funds are forced to actually buy negative yielding debt because it's AAA secure debt. But where does it make sense where you actually buy an asset that you're going to lose money on in the future? You know that you're going to lose money on in the future, but you're forced to buy it by the laws in the European Union. Same here in the United States too. If you go into negative, pension funds are going to be forced to buy these bad assets. So that is, it's not a good future that we're looking at here. And I think we're kind of seeing a peak debt here, because I've been looking at a lot of indicators lately, which shows that the inflation is substantially slowing down in most economies around the world. And it looks like it's almost reverting in some economies back to actual real deflation in the government, of course, manipulated numbers that they're putting out. So I think there's a deflationary pressure now because we've hit peak debt, and there's nobody else to lend money to. Who are we gonna, continue to lend all this money to? And when it comes to all this money that's been lent just in the United States, for example, in 2008, $13 billion worth of subprime mortgage debt blew up the whole world economy worldwide. Well, there's other, there's not the credit default, no collateralized debt obligations that's around. They're still around, but not in the amount that they are anymore. But now you're looking at what's called asset-backed securities and the collateralized loan obligations. So asset-backed securities can contain anything. They actually package student loans, credit card debt, auto loans, any other personal loans that you might have into these derivatives, and then just sell it off like they did in 2008. And they're doing it on a massive scale again. They're not at the levels of 2008 with those derivatives, but then you have all the collateralized loan obligation, and that's for the corporate debt. You have a lot of zombie corporations, as I call them in the United States, where these corporations, they can't actually pay off their debt. They just live in paying down the interest. Well, doesn't that sound familiar, how the United States government, the Canadian government, all governments around the world are only paying down the interest on their debt? If you and me, Mike, did that, well, it would be pretty quick that the bank would say, like, hey, it looks like you might be insolvent here. You can't pay your debt down.
Yeah.
So we just got to face the facts here that these, on top of all that debt, they're getting packaged debt now. And what I found, I looked through all the derivatives numbers for SIFMA, which is an organization that looks at all the derivatives in the United States, and I found that $53.2 billion in just subprime auto loans. So that versus the $13 billion that blew up in 2008, I think here, well, actually, it doesn't make sense because they printed about 4 times more, debt into the economy to prop the economy up. And I think since 2008, Mike, and I don't know if you agree with me or not, but I feel like we've been in a depression that has just been papered over and hidden for the population by all this massive money printing. Meanwhile, the real economy hasn't really recovered at all, and you're seeing just more and more financialization of the economy, meaning that, you just make money with money. It doesn't matter if you have a good product, a good valid product to provide to the population or not. And people are not doing the same research and development anymore in the corporations. They're all create basically debt and do share buybacks to prop up their share values. Where does that make sense in a real economy that is, solid and strong, as Donald Trump calls it? That doesn't look like a strong economy to me. That looks extremely weak, and it looks like a fake economy that is, propped up by all this fake money that's, slushing around the world. I don't know. I don't know, like where else we're gonna go, but down from this. And I think we're getting a lot closer now than I believe we've been, in the last couple of years. I believe that we could have seen it any time, but I think now they're really starting to struggle, and you're seeing a lot more people starting to questioning things like the Federal Reserve, and even questioning the government itself. And I think that's a substantial problem, because where does fiat currency gets its power from? It's actually the trust that the population will have in its value.
Yeah, and so it's a no-win situation on any part. And so you talk about currency and fiat currency rather, the whole currency manipulation aspect of things. So it looks like the currency war is officially on because China has declared a currency manipulator. Now, I guess the back and forth between the trade wars, I don't think there'll be a happy solution to any of this. What are your thoughts on this trade war? Would this only ramp things up more? And then how do you think the U.S. will respond if China continues to devalue the yuan?
I think there's going to be more and more tariffs coming from the Trump administration. They're going to keep on pushing, their America First model, I believe, which is, it's not usually like a completely terrible model. But the problem is they, shipped over all their jobs to China for the longest time. There was no manufacturing jobs left in the United States. So the problem became, you can bring them back to the United States, but now you got to remember that you got to pay at least 3-4 times to even 5 times more for the same product if you're gonna produce it over in the United States. So you would have substantial inflation through the wage inflation that it would create by that has to come down to the product cost. And I do see that I think there might be a breaking point here where China is just going to be like, screw it. They are in massive debt problems too, by the way. It's not just the United States. I believe it's something like 10 or 15 times that they doubled their debts in 2000. So you're looking at like almost a tenfold increase in debt there as well, and printing of currency. So they don't have a healthy economy either. Nobody's really healthy, but then people believe that, oh, the US dollar is going to continue to stay strong through it all. Well, it did in 2008. Everybody flooded back to the US dollar, but then the problem was that everybody flew into the US dollar. So there's nowhere else to go after that. And then, of course, we all know what happened in 2008 with the stock market, just massive, drop in the share price values of most corporations. So, yeah, the United States is the strongest of the fiat currencies, but it doesn't really matter because it in itself is a fiat currency, and if people stop believing in its value, you would still have the failure of the currency, no matter how much the propaganda from Mnuchin, from Powell, all these guys, that are trying to prop up the U.S. empire. You're still going to have that failure coming in for the U.S. dollar as well. And of course, this is happening now around the world, where we see gold going to record highs in Canadian dollars and Australian dollars and Singapore dollars, whatever currency it is outside of the United States. We see massive record highs right now in the value, the actual currency price in gold, which means that it's dropping in value, and that's the manipulated gold price, by the way. There could be as much as 300-400 contracts to one, and if you remove that, we have a friend of ours that took time and calculated that price. He said he believes it's going to be like 56 to 60,000 US dollars per ounce of gold, and then about $1,100 for silver, for example. And we talk about the problems as well with the value, like gold going up, which is actually good for us that are protect ourselves with our wealth. Which gold and silver is a wealth insurance to me. It's not an investment, as a lot of people out there talk about. Oh, gold's going on. There's nothing happening with them. But if you understood that it was a wealth insurance, you just stow it away and just wait for the right time, which is coming closer and closer, where gold and silver will eventually win when the fiat currency fails. But yeah, I think we're heading for just more and more of these currency wars, a lot more like tariffs on each other. You're seeing the blossom of nationalism everywhere and the protectionism of the economies in the world. So I think you're just going to see more and more of that, like self-protectionism of their own economy. And meanwhile, of course, China, I don't know if people have followed what's happening in Hong Kong, where they're trying to basically take over and intimidate and beat up people in Hong Kong to kind of submit themselves to the Chinese government and implement the technocratic grid that China has. But people that believe that China is going to be the main empire after the United States, I'm not 100% sure here. I really hope that the end game is going to be, of course, the failure of all these currencies, and people are going to wake up in all these different countries to the miserable value that and the destruction that printing of currency creates in an economy. It creates poverty. It creates people. I don't know how many people died from printing of currency. Maybe some of the economists should wake up to that, and the basically mass murder that happens on a worldwide scale of people that dies because of the monetary policies that they made. It's very dangerous what they've done. The more money you print, the more the gap between the rich and the poor will be. They're talking about, oh, we're going to tax people more. We're going to start to print more money for the poor, like modern monetary theory. None of that's really going to help the economy at all, or the regular person. It's just going to make things a lot worse for everybody, no matter what they try to do. So I think there's just no way out of this than just understanding what we've done to ourselves. We destroyed the world and the economy with all this fake paper currency that was printed into oblivion by governments that continue to perpetuate the problem by constantly doing deficit spending to prop up the system. And I think it's time to just call an end to all of this, and just understand that we're heading towards a failure of the current monetary system that we have on a worldwide scale this time. We never had that in history. We usually had just a couple of currencies or one or two that went full fiat and then failed. And now we're seeing it on the worldwide scale. So you're just seeing that race to the base. Who knows? Maybe even Trump hopes that they're going to print a lot more dollars now with the interest rates cut. He's hoping for maybe 0.5 or a 0.75% interest rate cut to keep this debt-ridden economy going. But there's not going to be any way out of that, Mike. And I think we're in for, like, no matter how much they fight putting tariffs on each other and try to print more of their currency, to devalue their currency, to make it more competitive, I think it's just going to be a misery on all fronts for everybody, and it's not going to make anybody any better off by this currency war. And I really hope not that somebody is stupid enough, but you never know when an empire falls, to actually start a hot war with someone over these disagreements. So basically the failure of the monetary system.
Yeah. Now, let me get your thoughts on what seems to be put out in mainstream attention nowadays and happen to be with decentralization, cryptocurrency, just the whole cryptography aspect of, transparency with blockchain. What are your thoughts on that? Is that being something that was positioned strategically for this time frame, or is it going to be utilized to help provide opportunities and alternatives for people as far as transferring value and things of that nature as we head into the future?
Well, I think it's a two-edged sword, Mike, and it's the actual cryptocurrencies that were created for good, which I still believe Bitcoin was. I don't think the government created Bitcoin necessarily. I think a lot of these cryptocurrencies has good, because we're seeing that we're going from centralization to decentralization. This happens throughout history. In nation states and so on, you go from full tyranny to anarchy to government again, to more government and more government, and then peak government, and then it fails again. So you have the centralization of power, and then the decentralization of power happens naturally. We actually see that in a very rapid scale with computers, interestingly enough, where first you had the actual terminals, which was centralized. You had the central storage facility or server at the locations where everybody used for storage. Then you had the personal computer come out, which had its own hard drive and had the own content on the hard drive, which was decentralized storage. But then now we moved back to cloud storage again, which is basically everything at a centralized data center somewhere that everything is getting stored at. And a lot of people doesn't even know that most of the times they've set up so they have the cloud on Google or on Apple or Microsoft. Like, it's all like cloud based, and you're not saving a lot of the stuff onto your computer anymore. But meanwhile, there's actually I saw YouTube and I believe this is where we're going on the power of decentralization again. And I think we're going to see decentralized storage applications coming back again, where it might actually be more based upon the BitTorrent model. I don't know if your viewers are familiar with BitTorrent, but if you compare Bitcoin to BitTorrent, for example, they've been trying to ban illegal downloading for the longest time. And they never were able to stop BitTorrent because it's just people sharing files peer-to-peer between each other. And this is what's happening with Bitcoin too. It's very similar, where it's all decentralized. There's no central control unit. They can't just shut down Bitcoin because everybody has their a copy a lot of times of or there's a ton of people that have the copy of the actual blockchain on their computer. So you would see, no matter if you shut down, let's say 100,000 people that running Bitcoin or have the whole blockchain, well, there's still going to be one copy of that blockchain is enough to reconstruct that whole system from bottom up again and restart the whole system again. So it's not going to be very easy. But of course, the governments are trying to use this technology to really enslave us. And one of the favorite things that they've been talking about, and I read a book a couple of years back called The Curse of Cash by Kenneth Rogoff, where he's talking about going cashless. because the problem that he found with cash was that, of course, he says that all the criminals are using it, but it's also tax evasion. The government can't officially get enough taxes. That was the two major things, of course, of eliminating cash that they wanted. They wanted more taxes in, and they wanted to, stop money laundering and people, evading paying taxes and so on. What is currently happening, though, they want to replace this. I think the number one thing that he barely mentioned in his book was that he kind of mentions, and it removes the possibility for bank runs. So, and to tell people what a bank run is, they probably know, but a bank run is when people go and want to take cash out of their ATMs at their local bank, and then suddenly the bank runs out of cash. And here in Canada, the cash to deposit ratios, I went into the consolidated financial statements of banks. They are terrible. The biggest banks, they're between 3% till 0.55% cash to deposit ratio. And our credit unions was from 2.5 down to 0.1% cash to deposit ratio. So they're very weak, the banks. So that's why also another reason for implementing these blockchain solutions. And I'm looking currently, it said Fed's real-time payment system to compete with Wall Street. So it looks like the Federal Reserve is building a service right now that could eventually evolve into being eCash. Here in Canada, we have something called Project Jasper 3, which is based on the Ripple blockchain, which is actually a cash replacement system as well. So they actually work on that here in Canada. And the Canadian government, the Canadian Central Bank of Canada, just recently did a blockchain transaction between two different blockchains. So they actually did a blockchain transaction with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is called Project Uniper, their project of going cashless, but they use Quorum, which is JP Morgan's blockchain that they've created for themselves. So both of these, they actually did a transaction from the central bank in Canada through the whole banking system in Canada into the Singaporean banking system and into the central bank. So they have made this to work between two blockchains already. So they have the solutions. A lot of central banks have these solutions ready, and who knows? I think that is the main move that they will do. They will need these blockchain cashless systems in order to really go negative with the economy. And then these economists believe that they're going to force people to spend more money into the economy by creating by forcing people to pay basically a tax, which is the negative interest rates. And then people try to spend more money not to have it in the bank account, and they believe that that's going to be create monetary velocity is going to go up because of that. But these guys, they only think that they're going to be able to go cashless and take away basically all of your freedoms that you have by the possibility to be using cash in order to save the economy and make the economy thrive again, which is just utter BS. It's not going to happen, and we're going to live in an enslavement grid, or we could have our decentralized ledgers out there that could work as mediums of exchange outside of the banking system and not be dependent on these institutions that have been in control of our world for ever since Venice in year 500 when the real first banks came out. So I think we're on a verge where there's a huge competition here that decentralization and the distributed ledgers, blockchain ledgers could compete with, you either go one way or the other way. We either go into total tyranny like they are in the communist government of China, or you could have total freedom like Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies could have for you by being outside and not being dependent on bankers to run our world anymore, and become an independent human being and just live your life free of the control grid that they really want to implement. I think just a desperate last attempt to keep the system alive.
Right. Well, John Sneisen, it's been great having you on. I'll definitely link all your information to the book you mentioned as well as your website beneath this video here. As always, looking forward to reaching out again. Hopefully, a couple months from now, we'll have a more happier conversation if things don't come to complete end. But other than that, thanks for joining us here on Silver Doctors, and enjoy your day, my friend.
Thank you, Mike.